Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Jewish history, an immense topic that today obviously we can only introduce and limiting to Europe actually, because otherwise it starts becoming more than impossible, which it already is. Quite glad to talk about it because it's kind of the first time we talked about Jewish history. I think something about Hellenistic warfare, the Battle of Azotus between and the Jews and the Seleucids. But we never quite addressed the medieval side in here. So, as I was saying, we can only introduce it at this point to start eventually talking more in depth about it in the future. So, the history of the Jewish people naturally coincided for a long time with the one of the Kingdom of Israel, right? So, it's, talking about Jewish history, you can't separate objectively the very long history of the Jewish people from the ancient world up to this point, and realizing in fact all the implications that this meant. When you talk about medieval history, obviously we like to distinguish also certain aspects of it from the ancient world, but problems like the belonging to an empire, right, to an empire that is not of your same religion, that you have however to interact it with in a certain way. Today we talk specifically about Europe, but there is also Islam, there is also the Caliphate, and we will see how in there also the Jews had a great importance, probably even more than in Christian Europe. So these are things you have to bear in mind. We can't talk about them now. We'll probably address them sooner or later in Roman history, but we're discussing on Schwerpunkt. But definitely that's a very important starting point, especially with Roman times, because as you know that basically the Jews were subjugated by the Romans, were inserted into their empire. Let's say it in this way. Actually, as allies at the beginning, especially, it was a pretty strong relation. Eventually, with the Jewish revolts, things got pretty messed up, as we will see now. But the Jews at this point were deeply Hellenized in culture. They had belonged, in fact, to these great Hellenistic empires, as you know. The lands of the Judea were contended between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So there is a great, it's actually a flourishing society. It's a very prosperous one. And also, as you know, from a cultural point of view, it was very, very developed. So the Roman conquest occurred in 63 BC, when the Romans basically take out the last remnants of the Seleucids from the Near East with Pompey, and eventually, however, as we just said, some revolts brought in 135 A.D. to the political suppression of the Kingdom of Israel, and Jerusalem was basically forbidden to the Jews. So this was the beginning, as we know, of the Jewish diaspora in the world. The Jews had already, think about the settlement in Egypt, and eventually their expulsion, and then the Babylonian captivity, and lots of other events, including, in fact, the other conquests and other wars, in which the Jews had maintained more or less their autonomy. So at this point, instead, there is a marked change. There is the destruction of the Temple of Solomon that had actually occurred already in 70 A.D. So a deep change, a big trauma and crisis within the Jewish world that has to abandon their land and to start a different life. Under this point of view, it's important to underline, though, that the Jews were by themselves quite entrepreneurial, but globetrotters, right? They had, throughout Hellenistic times, in this larger, broader prosperity within which Israel was framed, they had started, becoming traders, founding new quarters in the most important Hellenistic cities. They are found in Rome already by the 2nd century BC, actually, right? And this was a world where this was practiced not just by the Jews, but by a lot of individuals. Think about the Roman merchants that arrived up to up to the Far East in China. So fundamentally, there is nothing strange about this, and this is important because sometimes you hear something like, "Oh well, before a certain time the Jews weren't in Europe; that they arrived just later during medieval times." But this is not entirely true. I mean, the consistent groups obviously started spreading in parallel with the progression, let's say the growth and the expansion of a European economy from the Mediterranean into continental Europe. But there is fundamentally nothing strange in thinking that there were several Jewish communities scattered around the Roman Empire already, even in regions like in Germany, for example. In Germany, already in Germania Superior, in the Roman province, there was a pretty consistent and active and dynamic Jewish community that naturally was framed within the empire, paid taxes and so on, and that's relatively far north, right? So we can easily assess that within the Roman Empire, the Jews had traveled and expanded and so on. And the same Christianity, after all, is the proof of how far, but obviously with all its difference. However, in that case, a Jewish emanation could spread and was shared from original community. Thinking about St. Peter and St. Paul, right? The fact St. Paul arrived in Rome, where it was already St. Peter's community, that were also conflictual at that point, because St. Peter was the kind of the more, in fact, Jewish branch of Christianity, if we can even say it approximately in this way. Well, with St. Paul it was different, but it's nevertheless very, very interesting to and very important to think of, especially of Roman times, but not just those ones, as this great basin of expansion and travel and sharing of ideas, but which we don't really know much, to tell the truth. We know way more about the Middle Ages than the ancient world, but so there is all a world that is hidden to us and that we can know through sources that are mostly archaeological, etc., but they show the complexity of a world where definitely all this characters could travel unhampered, let's say. And interestingly enough, as the Jews, St. Paul is one of the best examples. He was a Jew, and he was a Roman citizen, right? He could speak Greek, so that was really the best, the elite, in case of St. Paul. But that witnesses how the Jews were heavily Hellenized and integrated into this broader culture. Now, a very important event is the Constitutio, or Constitutio, if you prefer, Antoniniana of 212 AD, which basically, as you know, that all the citizens of all the people, let's say better, that lived within the empire and could speak Latin, essentially, became legally full Roman citizens. At that point in the 3rd century, equated to become more than a citizen, but a sort of subject. And naturally, the Jews were part of that. So this interesting part that within the empire, the Jews are Roman citizens, right? Since an early age, and they continue being so. However, already in this time, we see these as a sad aspect, naturally, of Jewish history, where there was a sort of hostility perceived by some of them, just like there had been towards the Christians in general, that were initially in fact pictured like as a sort of Jewish sect. It's not much because they were depreciated because they were Jewish, but they were causing trouble, let's say, in the Christian case. The Jewish communities as a whole actually being very relatively appreciated, because they actually there is this idea in tradition in Jewish culture that you have essentially to respect the laws of the place where you live, right? This was very important, had partially allowed that expansion of Judaism that we have seen before, and it was partly also inherited by Christianity. And this is important, though, because the Jewish communities within this broadly multicultural empire that had become at this point remained tied to their traditions. They had this strong sense of identity, that naturally was religiously based, but as you know, it's also about the people proper, the chosen people of God. So they had since this age this very strong sense of who they were and their tradition and their culture. So they could be easily identified in certain contexts to naturally also enter in contrast with other communities, which was terribly frequent in the late Roman Empire, and especially with the struggle between different religious groups. This is more evident at this point between the Christians that are already expanding and have become definitely already more than the Jews, numerically speaking, at this time, and the pagans. But this happened also with other communities. What was important then with the Christian Empire, of course, is that the Jews professed a monotheism that had a common Abrahamic root. All right, so this would have a great impact, naturally, both in in the Christian world and the Islamic one, given to the interaction of these three monotheisms. By the Christians, the same Jews were considered an elected people, to whom the prophets, to whose prophets God had dictated the base of the Gospels, because that objectively had happened in a Jewish world. The Old Testament, of course, that is a holy book also for the Christians, and at the same time they were recognized also by the Muslims eventually as a people of the book, right? So there was this between. Today we tend to differentiate a lot, like saying, this from this side were the Christians and Muslims and Jews, but in medieval times, in many ways, were very common bases, especially in Mediterranean. There was a very strong perception of the shared culture and past and vision of the world at the end of the day, that had between this civilization had put a lot in common, right? And a very important key of interpretation for reading the Middle Ages is to recognize the relatively unbiased approach that existed between all of these cultures, in spite of, naturally, especially, the Jews didn't have a country anymore at this point, but obviously the Christians and the Muslims had this territorial, more or less well-defined spheres, and then there was naturally warfare and clash. But if you study just the history of culture, all the great works of translation, the spread of knowledge, you realize that there was really a lot of blending of all these cultures. Scholastics is born thanks to the books that the manuscripts that the Muslims make pouring into Spain. From there they're translated by the Christians, and these are all texts of ancient classical wisdom that were integrated with other knowledge from places like Persia or India. Think about mathematics, or even more far east. And the Jews in this, especially early medieval, so a bit before, they had been crucial for the mediation of this knowledge, right? The Jews were quite entrepreneurial. There is this bit of forgotten Mediterranean history of the Jews in the early Middle Ages that places them really at the center of a wide net of traffics, of trade, some of the most before the Italians and the Italian Maritime Republic. Actually was the Jews within the when the Mediterranean was still largely more dominated by the Muslims, that were quite active in trade, in exchanging. In the same Byzantine world, of course, there were Jews. You know that with Justinian, there is a pretty sharp, there is the beginning of a persecution, a more sound persecution on the Jews, that, however, starts to also frame them within the empire with a kind of eschatological logic, meaning that the Jews basically were allowed into Christian lands because they had, in fact, this strong element in common with the Christians, and however, with a certain negative purpose, that is that they had to be the only acceptable existentially speaking, non-Christian community that had to witness the end of time, so the second come of Christ, and the fact that basically the Christians were right and not the Jews, right? So that was the, formally speaking, legally speaking, juridically speaking, also the ratio for which the Jews were accepted and partly regulated and persecuted, but also tolerated and defended by the state. We'll see this in especially also with the papacy. Today we won't be talking much about Byzantine world, but with the papacy that happened, the papacy became a great point of reference for European Jews during the Middle Ages, because it also granted them rights and protection, etc. Which is strange, and I realize that because we live in a world where you say, well, yeah, but they were still discriminated against. Yes, they were, absolutely, but we have to talk also about the concept of tolerance, what it was in the Middle Ages like, because that's important. Like because sometimes we use words improperly for different historical ages. Like when we talk about tolerance today, we mean essentially that you have to accept existentially for individual and in this sense your universal human dignity, the rights of individuals, right? And this is a concept that starts objectively from to be formulated and widespread essentially from the second half of the 17th century in Europe, right? So what existed previously was something very different that to us presents naturally quite a bit, of a perplexity, because tolerance in worlds like the ancient world or the Middle Ages was fundamentally based on a sort of balance between communities. That is, was a very pragmatic approach. Do I need this community for trade or to counter this other community? Well, okay, then I let it stay, right? And that's how practically, right, aside from idealizations, the Muslim rulers or Christian rulers protected and supported and integrated and were highly benefited actually from Jewish communities, always remaining that also bad things could happen, and sometimes authorities would benefit from that in turn. So that's quite of a serious and sad topic at the end of the day, and of this quite troubled Jewish history that is very important to acknowledge, right? Objectively, these were tough times. They were tough, a bit for everyone, but definitely being a minority which you're legally and actively discriminated against is not it's definitely not a pleasant situation. And in early medieval times are usually pictured, though, as somewhat of a slightly better time than the following centuries, right? Because in this time, for example, mass massacres of Jewish communities are not witnessed, or at least they probably were in some part, but there is no comparison with what would happen later. But it's important to acknowledge the role that the Jews, in virtue of being recognized as people of the book, reached, right? In terms of freedom of cult, right? Because definitely the Jews had freedom of cult, both at this point, at least, both in Christianity and in Islam, right? They were Islam attributed them the statute of protected, the dhimmi, right? And especially there were very important Jewish communities in some of the most advanced centers of the Islamic world and hence of the world at the time, such as Baghdad, Abbasid Baghdad, between the 8th and the 9th century, capital of the Caliphate, most advanced, scientifical, cultural, artistical center of the time, and Al-Andalus between the 10th and the 11th century, so the late Umayyad period, where that objectively was Umayyad Spain was quite a state, it had an administration, and in fact that's exactly where the Jews had very elevated roles in the statal administration. It's not because they were Jews proper. Like it's obvious that throughout all this time, there were lots of Jews that were perfectly like middle lower classes, right? But it's very meaningful that in this case in Islamic powers, some of the greatest personalities and figures and clerks of the state, statal administration, were Jews, right? Partly because of their education, because of their sense that we described before, their own identity and role, and education they had, right? The thing is, this is probably one of the most important things. And in fact, actually, during early medieval times, there was a lot of religious promiscuity overall. Like certain restrictions that would come later actually are the manifestation of a world where, and I've read it extensively about this stuff, where sometimes Christians and Jews or even other religions intermarried with not much of a problem, right? This is important to bear in mind, especially in certain contexts that were political contexts that were quite autonomous. Were, for example, important Jewish communities in southern Italy that at this point was a quite autonomous area from the empire. There were kind of coastal centers that were spreading, and trade with the Saracens was extensive. Jews had a great importance also in southern Spain. Southern Spain, they actually there were quite prosperous Jewish communities that worked essentially together with the commercial expansion of Islam. So the following regulation would happen in a quite of a different world, where things were starting to be way less spontaneous because political authorities were starting to be more powerful and more, let's say, directive. I don't know how to say that on society, right? And Jewish scholars were famous all around this world, in Baghdad, in Spain, in Norman Sicily. Some of the greatest scientists, philosophers, think about. Even in Jewish, broadly speaking, the most important figure is definitely Maimonides in the 12th century. That basically is the equivalent of the Jewish equivalent of the Christian Thomas Aquinas and Muslim Avicenna Ibn Sina, better said. So these men at that point were building a universal culture, a structured, scientific vision of the world. Through all this knowledge was pouring in from the libraries when the ancient manuscripts were copied, re-elaborated, and a figure like Maimonides is immense, right? And as I was stressing before, there were enormous similarities between the three monotheisms at this point from a cultural point of view, right? Jewish community definitely contributed to this medium, and then Christian Europe kind of arrived later, like scholastics. This developed mostly the century afterwards. So even these great Aristotelian constructions were coming from this Muslim and Jewish worlds that had first come into contact with this knowledge and philosophers had elaborated and read them on their own. This is very important in the history of the Middle Ages because this is not a passive acquisition of ancient knowledge. This is a further elaboration. I mean, yes, there is not a substantial elevation from a theoretical point of view. Much of what was written during the Middle Ages would remain unchanged up to the modern age fundamentally, but it's the ability of and the consciousness, the intellectual vivacity and thirst to take all this knowledge and try to make a synthesis of it and reading the world through it, and through here a monotheistic perspective that naturally the ancient world hadn't had. At least the Jews, this is the point, the Jews had it, right? The Christians partially, the Muslims obviously not, because they didn't exist at the time. But it was a way of, each one of these cultures was interpreting the world as light of their own past experiences. And in fact, it would be very interesting to talk about the history of Judaism. And very different, because Jewish society was very internally vivacious at this point. I mean, there is a lot of debate in their own regard, always based, just like in Christianity and in Islam. There was an orthodoxy that at this point was hopefully being challenged. But when new ideas pour in, and scholastics is a perfect example of that, you have to open up and integrate. So these are key figures that should be studied also in the history of philosophy from this particular backgrounds of theirs and their religious education, etc. But unfortunately, today we don't have much time. So progressively, however, there was a sensible increase in forms of marginalization and persecution and intolerance, right? The hostility and the intolerance towards the Jews were fueled by this broader culture that we have difficulties to study, in the sense, in the Christian background at the time, because sources we can't know naturally what the elites, what the general orthodox thinking about these things was, but we don't know much what at the lower strata of society happened. It was probably much less unregulated, much more tolerant as a whole, right? And unfortunately, the least we know about the same Jews as a minority that naturally produced less. They had a less, was less heard overall, and left less sources. So there was this admirable and very strong sense of identity that the Jewish community in all this context maintained, right? And this was seen by anti-Semites as extraneous to certain, I would say, I can't say national, because there is really no national sense broadly meant, but there is a certain local identity for which the Jews are perceived differently, not just from a religious point of view. That is the second factor, right? The Jews are the Dacites for the Christians, and that's the negative thing. And that's how stupidly can be that discrimination comes from, right? There is a minority, there is a story that is invented about them, and therefore those are scapegoats that you can target in every way. So that's how sadly it occurred at the end of the day. But it's obvious that in a world that is dominated by religion, and where there is a strong emphasis, especially towards the 10th and the 11th century, this idea of religion as a broader ecumenic, national, if you want, identity, national sense meant in the way the place where you live. It's obvious that this unity brings to consider everyone who is different as a problem in a way or another, if not a threat, but someone that, why is that person equal to me, right? So unfortunately, these things happen all the time. Historically speaking, there is really not even an end to that. And in this particular case, the ratios were such for which it's not that the Jews could oppose themselves to it. Part of, fortunately for them, there was no real potential threat posed by them. I mean, like the Muslims had their own empires, their own armies, etc. The Jews were peaceful communities. They didn't have any any reason to go against the general, what society was. We've seen how Jewish tradition was really all about being agreeable fundamentally with the local customs, local laws. So it wasn't a big deal, right? But within Christianity, things were changing. So there is the basic accusation of the acids, as we have said, because the Jews were accused, obviously, having entrusted assault Christ to the Romans, so that he could be condemned, because it was Jewish will, right? And Pilatus said, "I don't care, do what you want," and therefore, for this reason, the church was favorable to their emargination from civil life, right? There was, in this sense, a broader. This is a kind of a simplistic explanation, right? It's not that simple. Here, the problem is not that the Christians really cared probably much about such things. The problem is that there was at this point a new authority that was being strengthened, both from an ecclesiastical and monarchical point of view, that had to show in front of its subjects that fundamentally or faithful, that there was an orthodoxy that had necessarily to deal, who was different in a way for which within the structures of power there could be an order, right? So that the Jews were sacrificed in the process. So it's interesting, though, that this is the same time into which, and it's not a coincidence, the Jewish communities were expanding. Why do I say this is not a coincidence? Essentially because the strengthening of certain monarchical and ecclesiastical structures was going in parallel with trade, with commerce, with an increased, with a revival of European economy to which the same Jews had contributed. And therefore these communities grow. Like all the others, they expand. They have a longer range of action from an entrepreneurial point of view. So you have a consistent spread from the Mediterranean to the Italian and in the German cities of Jewish communities, right? So this is interesting because it's the Mediterranean perspective. There is also the Eastern perspective that today we don't talk much of, but is equally important. That is the Jews of Khazaria, right? That is quite of an interesting topic, because there is all the problems, those who were they, how were their part. This is mostly a Jewish problem, like, were these descendants of the tribes of the original tribes of Israel? Was there, were just converted? The history of the Khazars is complicated, because this were a sort of confederation that had been born in what would be today's Kazakhstan, in north of the Caspian Sea, which is a lake, telling the truth, that there was in fact across Eurasia, right, and controlled trade routes. It was kind of a commercial empire, and the Khazars were in some good relation. I mean, with the Byzantines, decided to, which were the Khazars were pagans. Excuse me. At this point, decided to convert to Judaism. Now the story is a bit more complicated, because there was never like such a strong and centralized Khazar state for which you could say that there is a sort of religion of state, right? Judaism basically was accepted as a in order to become presentable to a monotheistic power like the Byzantines were. The Byzantines also married certain Khazar princesses that were formerly Jewish in this sense, but many Khazars were also Muslim. There were surely some Christian minorities as well. So when the Khazars get destroyed by the Rus, this commercial empire collapses, and all of these communities that are now formerly Jewish in part spread in various directions, including west into Eastern Europe. So many rising powers, mostly of Slavic origin, that were rising at the time, including in Russia, but also in Poland and in other areas, accept parts of this Jewish elements, and they are attracted, and they are called actually by the same rulers, because the rulers of these Eastern European powers have this main problem of centralizing, right, in societies that were very, very socially egalitarian. So for which the rise of these monarchies was very, very slow, right? And the main problem is money, as always, for having an army and founding cities and making trade work. So these Jewish communities from the East are the best ones because they are already very well versed in commerce. They're outcomers. This is the advantage because they were foreigner, so they could be settled by kings exclusively by their own authority and without being part of, and therefore remaining tied to monarchic power and legitimizing it, because it was effectively the only one that they could be justified. In the world, it wasn't, at this point, was, if not Christian, was a road for being completely Christianized. And this is something you can find elsewhere. It's like a bit the Muslims that the Swabians kind of preserve in southern Italy because they're Muslims. So they being a Muslim enclave in a Christian country and being protected by the king, the only they have to be necessarily faithful to the monarchy, right? Because if they are not faithful to the monarchy, they're left on the road. They don't have anyone who can support them. That's the same reason why, for example, many Christian rulers have Muslim guards, like in that case, or Muslim rulers have Christian guards. It's the idea of attracting a foreigner so that he can counter the local communities, the push of the local communities, their hostility, and creating a NATO relation, a clientele that is faithful to the monarchy. So the Jews in Eastern Europe have a great importance because they are the ones that are associated with the development of towns, of trade, and are very appreciated. They're very wealthy, actually. They're sometimes as powerful as the local nobility, and this naturally causes antipathy within the local nobility. They start seeing these communities as not just foreigners, but even unbelievers, because they weren't Christians. So hence, even certain characters of xenophobia and of anti-Semitism that are developed at this time on a loosely speaking national base, right? The idea is that I don't, and sadly enough, these are attitudes that historically speaking were to remain in these countries. And not just in Eastern Europe, but basically all over Europe in different degrees. And this is very sad, but it definitely also corresponds to a very important historical dynamic that reveals the importance and that the Jews had also in the construction of this, in the support at least that they gave to the construction of these more orderly systems of monarchies, etc. And monarchs were quite clever to use them in this way. And naturally speaking, these communities were flourishing. As we've seen before in Italy, in Germany, were spreading definitely in France, in Britain. Spain was, historically speaking, a big center of Jewish presence, even before the Umayyad Caliphate. Actually, even in Visigothic Spain, there were very large communities that were, in fact, protected, there was a bit a swinging policy in this sense. Sometimes they were protected, sometimes they were persecuted. It really depended on the monarch. But this tells us, in any case, that they were important. They were important for the economy. They were important for the local balance, political balance, and they were ancient. These are ancient communities, right? Some of the most ancient European communities in this sense from those times, right? Because they remained, right? There are they also were, in fact, they didn't disperse. They started being attached, in fact, to these local countries as well. There are starting to be distinctions even between the same European Jewry of different languages, of different customs, right? Think about the Sephardites, think about the Ashkenazis, etc. So as we were saying, there were increasing limitation to Jewish freedom in this context, and increased regulation and margination, eventually persecution from the side of the local authorities. The Carolingians had been fairly tolerant, but the Jewish were prevented from making proselytism. Eventually, in Europe, the Jews were prevented from purchasing land. This is very important. That's one of the reasons why they as we will see now, they would expand into money lending, because if you don't have land, that is the base of economy at the time, there's not much else, many other options. There is this the inscription to they're forbidden from corporations and crafts, so they can't associate with other workers, which it hadn't been like that in the past. There were Jewish traders and craftsmen that had worked together with the Christians before. The only economical activities that were allowed to the Jews were trade, money lending. Then instead was prohibited to the Christians. The church had forbidden Christians from charging interest to fellow Christians. This is also a bit of a of an ideal, because actually as long as credit activities developed into Europe, Christians started making them as well. But formally speaking, at least, only the Jews could do that, and that's also why they started expanding in these fields. The Christians at one point towards late Middle Ages were, with the with the acceptance of the papacy that actually defined these rules, had bypassed the problem of money lending by stating that banks or other credit activities could receive a certain amount of money as a form of expense for the money depot, basically. So this was a way to do trade and banking without any problem. So also this idea that it was just the Jews who did money lending, well, it's not really true. It's not really true. And actually, as also it's a myth that they were exclusively about that. They lived in different contexts and conditions, so it's pretty it's too generalizing to say, well, they were mostly about this activity, right? And not everywhere there were the same laws, naturally. So together with this progressive margination, persecution proper increased, right? The Jews were often described and depicted as usurers and starvers, and there was an increase of violence that, as we will see, especially began with the first crusade, right? There was this Christian zeal that was preached, that sometimes we say, because it was about religion. Well, yes and no, meaning that it's obvious that the thing started with this first, so-called the Poor's Crusade, that started gathering all this mass of desperate people, so without any logistical base. So it's obvious that whichever city they arrived, they were just a branch of martyrs, and they found a Jewish community and they said, these are the infidels. They're not Christians. They won't be saved, and they massacred them. There were horrifying massacres of Jews, starting from the First Crusade in countries like Germany, especially, but also and this was replicated elsewhere, right? With an astonishing frequency that is very painful to observe. And interestingly enough, though, and this is important to look at the complexity of medieval Christianity, this pushes mostly started from the lower strata of the population initially, or at least in certain contexts. The papacy tried to contain these violences. Actually, there was this bull that there was issued around the first one by Calixtus the second in 1120, known as Sicut Iudeis. So this was a constitution for the Jews, basically, that expressed the official position of the papacy regarding the Jews throughout a bit all the Middle Ages, and even later, right? And this bull actually intended to protect Jews, especially the ones that had been suffering during the First Crusade. And it was reaffirmed by many popes even until the 15th century. And this is very interesting because this bull forbade, besides other things, Christians from forcing Jews to convert. Now, this is a very important thing. This was a papal bull that, was the standard position, and said Christians cannot force the Jews to convert. They don't have to do it, because obviously these things had happened, right? So the church said, no, this shouldn't happen. As it was forbidden absolutely to harm the Jews or to take their property. And this tells you a lot, because it's obvious that, it was full of people who could simply say, oh, well, those are Jews, now I'm going to steal their property because they're not even Christians. No, you can't do that. And the papacy stood firmly for this, because the papacy had this positive role of pacification during the Middle Ages. If you objectively look at what the story was within the Christian community, the idea is that there was a war, there was a massacre, there was turmoil. The papacy tried always to forbid this. You say, oh well, but what about the persecution of heretics? Well, persecution of heretics swinged from violent outbreaks of this kind of pillaging and violence against the elites, etc., to of course, being butchered by crusader armies that at that point were not much about the idea of crusade, but of invading other lands, like every other political authority did at the time, which with the neighbors, right? So the thing here is very shaded, but the papacy had, and this example with the Jews is very eloquent about this. Had an interest for maintaining order. Right, maintaining, stopping unrest. This is important for a community. I mean, just imagine that these Jews might have been a minority, but they would have defended them. They would have resisted to these violences, and this would have created further problems, violence, flaring, disorders. So, no, Christians cannot force the Jews to convert. They have to leave them alone. They don't have to harm them. They don't have to steal their properties. They don't have to disturb the celebration of their festivals or to interfere with their cemeteries, for example. And the pain was excommunication. Now, this is very important. The official position of the papacy was enforced was that if you disturbed the Jews, you were excommunicated. Now, this is a very civil approach, right? So it's really important, and that's where we get to the concept of tolerance we're trying to explain before. It was shaded because the Jews, for example, were imposed by the Lateran Council in 1215 also discriminatory regulations, right? For example, to bring a reconnaissance mark on their clothes. It was usually a yellow circle of cloth, and this was aimed to avoid relation with Christians, right? So mixed marriages were forbidden unless Jews, for example, wanted to convert to Christianity, which also happened. It's full of marriages between, especially from the Christian side, of Christian men marrying Jewish women that were now, however, converted to Christianity, right? Willingly, right? Not forcibly. So you could do that evidently, and that obviously was a Christian interest. Was kind of rarer the other way around, but it had happened as well. and since the 13th century appeared in various European cities, but also in the Muslim countries, reserved zones that were mandatorily assigned to the Jews, and these were the ghettos, right? And this naturally has an impact also in the history of European urbanism. And ghettos, as discriminating as they were evidently, and they have reinforcing this conception, but they were partly, and this is kind of also difficult to understand for us today, they were partly created in order to protect the Jews from the rest of the community, because evidently, as we have seen, those violence had begun, and now we will see which kind of violences. So the ghettos, at least, so the Jews, don't get me wrong here, they went under many humiliations, right? The Jews had to sometimes be ritually humiliated. This is something that happened even up to through the modern age. The contemporary age are very, they were kicked publicly. They had, in places like Rome, they had to pass under Titus' arc. All these things were definitely aimed at reinforcing the Christian superiority of humiliating this community. Eventually, such dispositions were commuted with attacks, right? But these are definitely the very negative sides of the story, that we that there is no way to think of a positive way of conceiving them in the first place. But there was extreme violence as well, as we were saying, true massacres on a large scale. So as we mentioned before, this began in the German cities around 1096, 1095, so the years of the First Crusade. These were known as pogroms, right? So these are turmoils, popular anti-Jewish turmoils, also as a consequence of the announcement of the First Crusade against the infidels, right? So whoever wasn't Christian that found himself or herself around the way of this groups could be even killed. So this is in many ways the true beginning of European anti-Semitism. The massacres and fires of the places of cult, the synagogues, began with this fanatic view that the Jews were the inextinguishable enemies of Christianity, that were suspected, basically, because of their secluded life, of carrying out abominable cults, like the profanation of the consecrated host, to knead into unleavened bread during the Jewish Easter, which is kind of ridiculous. If anything, aside from the accusation, but for the fact that that secluded life was a consequence of active emargination. So they had been brought to that by the same people who were attacking them now. So these are kind of obviously the same stupid thoughts that we can recognize from much more recent times in our history that have anti-Semitism, in my opinion, is the ultimate proof of the moral decay of a society. Like, there is no other way to picture it, frankly. It's one of the most disgusting and truly senseless ideologies. I mean, there are certain forms of discrimination that maybe have some sort of that there was a problem originally, right? In the case of anti-Semitism, this is a complete nonsense. There has never been an actual problem in the first place. That these communities were simply targeted because of their religion, their beliefs that were harmless for the rest of the population. And we're talking about entire massacres. and there is a thread, definitely, to massacres of the First Crusade up to even recent, what was it? The guy shot to a synagogue a few weeks ago. It's the same madness repeating itself over and over and over and over again. And I personally actually have a lot of friends. I don't have many friends in the first place, so I was thinking about the race way of phrasing it. Let's say all the Jewish people I met are particularly polite, intelligent, and educated people. If there is a group, a human group in this world that I kind of have a positive bias towards, is objectively the Jews, and this is something I had since I was a kid, telling the truth. Where I wasn't even presented very much, excessively with certain historical flow. I wasn't brought to believe that. I simply experienced it on my own. So frankly, talking about this stuff is always very blood boiling, because there is a sense of injustice and rage that is definitely justified. So there were also another very dramatic aspect of this story. It was the expulsions, right? Since the 13th century especially, sovereigns of several Christian kingdoms expelled Jewish communities from their kingdoms. Trying to rationalize these things a little bit, it's the idea that by the 13th century, Christian monarchies acquire a certain degree of political and social control that wasn't possible before. So the main reason for which the Jews were expelled was definitely the confiscation of their goods, right? If a monarchy needed to cash fast, expel the Jews, steal all their properties, and get richer, at least for a little while. Right. This could also backfire, because as we've seen, the Jews, and this happened countless times also with other religious groups in history, that they were quite economically dynamic. It's like a bit like, the revocation of the Edict of Tolerance toward the Huguenots in 17th century France by Louis XVI. It was a big economic loss at the end of the day. It went at the benefit of Prussia, that was rising at the time. It was taking all these Protestants. This happened similarly a bit with the Jews here. Many monarchies had also contracted debts with Jewish lenders. This is very important. So you say, you know what, I don't pay your credits anymore. I take everything, right? So the Jews get expelled first from England in 1290, and then in France in 1322. Eventually, as we know, in Iberia at the end of the Reconquista, in Spain in 1492, in Portugal in 1498. With Spain especially was a pretty big thing because of the so-called, in Spanish, limpieza de sangre, which means basically that there was, I don't remember what was the grade, 1/4, that everybody had to convert forcibly to Christianity or being expelled. This happened both with the Muslims and the Jews. Albeit Spanish society was strongly, there had, as we've seen historically, there had always been a very strong Jewish component in Spanish society. It's pretty ironic, because at that time King Ferdinand of Aragon, his mother was Jewish, for example. Even the confessor of Isabel of Castile was a Christian bishop, was actually a convert. He was a Jew, originally speaking. Excuse me. And so there is this hypocrisy that obviously goes unnoticed, that there are forced conversions of both of Jews and Muslims in that context that continue practicing, however, their beliefs. And there was even a certain degree of acceptance for what happened, privately speaking, at the time, because that world was much more public than than our own, right? The people lived much more publicly than we do. So it was very important also in this sense, and we can motivate if we even can't justify such measures, but we can motivate them in the sense that at the end of the Reconquista there was that need for asserting this Christian triumph over the infidels that were kicked out of Spain, etc. So Spain had a lot of problems with being unified because there were still like lots of different powers, right? Spain was never quite unified like France or England, right? There were several kingdoms stuck together, so it was very important for Spain to stress this unity in religion, for which brought this discriminatory measures, right? Even the Inquisition in Spain was the first common tribunal, because that was common to Castile, Aragon, Navarre, etc., and that before objectively hadn't existed because those were all different kingdoms. Now with the dynastic union of Castile and Aragon, things had changed. So even this national policy at this point, Spanish national policy, entailed this discrimination against different religions. And this was the moment in which many of these Jewish communities fled to relatively more tolerant kingdoms, such like the one of Poland, right? We mentioned also before. So if you wonder where the once so populous before the Holocaust Jewish community of Poland came from, well, it had come largely from this, and as we have seen, that was a measure for the Polish kings to try to centralize a little bit more through the invitation of these communities that, aside from their economic importance, they were simply another community that could be used in the balance of powers. It was fundamental in medieval politics, right? Having a multicultural kingdom brings you to play much more easily from the above in order to balance all the forces, right? Because you can play in several elements that they're already sometimes in competition with each other, and that have. So the development also, as we were saying before, of xenophobia and of anti-Semitism stemmed from these monarchic policies sometimes, right? Because the noblemen especially because when first the monarchy had used Jewish administrators that had enriched themselves and were in competition with the aristocracy, obviously they didn't like the Jews. Then eventually, when the monarchy promotes this discrimination, the people kind of agrees, because feeling part of this greater kingdom that is Christian has to expel all the others. So this really set some roots of statal anti-Semitism by certain standards that had definitely an echo and a continuation, historically speaking, right, up to very modern times. And another episode of extreme violence, actually, is the one that occurred with the Black Death of 1348. Because this event, as shocking and traumatizing and devastating as it was, brought, as one of the consequences, to this mass hysteria that brought to new Jewish pogroms, right? So the Jews at this point were accused to have voluntarily provoked the epidemics, and they were massacred Europe-wide in enormous numbers, right? Very big. Certain scholars claim that only the genocide promoted by the Nazi regime in the 20th century actually surpassed the dimension of the pogrom of 1348, 1350, which I'm relatively skeptical, because actually quite bloody pogroms happen also after this, but the size of the one of these years was pretty damn big. And just why? Because people were freaking out and said, "Oh, those are the Jews. Those are the non-Christians, that they have done it against us. That's as simple as it gets in a world of ignorance. Although there are new studies about this stuff, because naturally they draw much of attention, and there are very interesting contexts. I think one was from a German city, but I don't remember where it showed one of these massacres, basically, right? And that was interesting because it was led by certain merchant oligarchs in order to take out Jewish property, simply to cash. So that was a brilliant example, because the formal excuse is that these were the usual deicides and all this stuff, and they were plotting against the Christians and all this stuff. Hence, let's steal their stuff, and most of their and massacre them and rape them, all the worst imaginable things. And you can naturally imagine how, historically speaking, these things happen. There is an elite that has an even interest. It spreads rumors among the ignorant people, right? And an ignorant people believes this stuff because it feels part of a group. It feels part of the this idea. We are the Christians. That's the terrible Jewish minority that plots against us. So that ignorant mass becomes a tool for who has the broader interests, that doesn't care anything about the masses, doesn't care about Jewish community, and is able to sacrifice it bloodily in a blink of an eye, simply to steal their goods, because they have gotten the option of, with the excuse of religion, to take them out. So this is extremely crude as a history, and it's difficult to find something that can counterbalance that, the negatives here. What we can add maybe is that, and this is the concept I would like to leave you with, that despite of all these violences and eventual even forced conversions, as we've seen, the papacy had forbidden it, but still that happened in many countries. Even that's why also the monarchies starting building their own power that gets detached from the papal one. There is a positive interaction between Jews and Christians during the Middle Ages. This is very important. It was kind of unusual, right? In terms of there was a robust cultural and social interaction between Jews and Christians. Unusual, probably much had to do with the deep relation that naturally exists between the two religions. But there is much more. There was probably, I want to interpret it in this way, it was probably a mutual recognition or respect in some ways, right? It's obviously an elitary thing. The average people didn't give a damn. But, the concept, for example, that the Jews increasingly aligned themselves with the protective power of the papacy is quite of a relevant historical datum. The Jews were recognizing now the authority, the legitimacy of this of the church in the regulation of their secular affairs, fundamentally. They recognized the fact that the papacy accepted their own their freedom of cult, the fact that they had to be, yes, isolated, marginated, but still protected in the process, so that nobody could harm them, right? And as even if there were exceptions Europe-wide, still there were some Christian authorities that the Jews trusted, because they knew that they were working for their own stability, at least. So this is important, in my opinion, as a historical perspective, and it should be explored. Probably it's already been done, of course, but it's very interesting and meaningful. Just for saying that the Middle Ages weren't this terrible dark hole where everything that happened was bad, right? And this naturally hasn't anything to do with condoning in any way all the violence and discrimination that existed against the Jews, not just during the Middle Ages, but sadly enough, most of their history actually. So yeah, and definitely it doesn't finish here. Hopefully we will talk about this more and more, but this video was just to give the series of perspectives, more or less, not a big deal, but still relevant. And I needed this chapter. After almost 500 videos, I realized I hadn't talked about medieval Jews, and it was kind of for a channel dedicated to medieval Europe is kind of weird. So here we go, and hopefully we will expand this topic soon. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.